Something happened during the Ukraine war that almost nobody in Europe fully understood at the beginning. The war did not just transform Ukraine, it transformed Europe itself. And at the center of that transformation stands a man that many intelligence agencies quietly believed would either flee Kyiv, lose power, or disappear from history within the first week of Russia's invasion. Volodymyr Zelenskyy. When Russian troops crossed the border in February 2022, the strategic assumptions inside much of the international system were brutally simple. Russia possessed overwhelming military superiority. Ukraine's government was expected to collapse rapidly. Western officials privately discussed contingency plans for exiled governments and insurgency scenarios. Even some NATO analysts believed Kyiv could fall within days. Instead, something entirely different happened. Zelensky stayed. And that decision changed the trajectory of European security more profoundly than most people realize even today. Because before the war, Europe existed inside a very different strategic reality. For decades after the Cold War, much of Europe gradually reduced military spending, weakened defense industries, and built economic systems around the assumption that large-scale war on the continent had become unlikely. Energy cooperation with Russia expanded. European economies prioritized globalization over militarization. Political leaders focused on climate policy, trade integration, and economic modernization rather than preparing for prolonged conventional warfare. The basic assumption was simple. The age of industrial war in Europe was over. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and suddenly Europe discovered that many of its core strategic assumptions were dangerously outdated. But here is the critical point most people still misunderstand. It was not only the invasion itself that transformed Europe. It was Ukraine's resistance. And specifically, Zelensky's decision to turn Ukrainian survival into a larger political and psychological mission for the entire European continent. Because in the opening days of the war, Zelensky did something extremely unusual for a modern political leader under invasion. He refused to behave like a collapsing president. No evacuation, no exiled government, no negotiations from safety abroad. Instead, he positioned himself directly inside Kyiv and transformed Ukrainian resistance into a symbolic confrontation about the future of Europe itself. That symbolism mattered enormously, because wars are not only fought through weapons and territory, they are fought through narratives. And Zelensky rapidly understood that Ukraine could not defeat Russia through military strength alone. Ukraine needed something far more powerful, European emotional commitment. So Zelensky reframed the war, not as a regional territorial dispute, not as a post-Soviet conflict, but as a defining struggle over whether Europe still believed in defending its own democratic order under military pressure. That reframing changed everything. European governments that initially hesitated suddenly faced enormous political pressure internally. Public opinion shifted rapidly. Military aid expanded. Defense budgets surged. NATO unity strengthened. Germany reversed decades of military caution almost overnight. Finland and Sweden moved toward NATO membership. Eastern European governments accelerated rearmament aggressively. And perhaps most importantly, Europe psychologically re-entered the age of hard power. That transformation may become Zelensky's most important historical legacy, because before 2022, Europe increasingly relied on the United States as the unquestioned foundation of continental security. NATO existed, but many European militaries lacked sufficient readiness for prolonged high-intensity conflict independently. Defense production capacity had weakened after decades of post-Cold War reduction. Strategic dependence on American military leadership remained extremely high. The Ukraine war exposed those weaknesses brutally. European stockpiles depleted rapidly, ammunition shortages appeared, defense manufacturing limitations became obvious, energy dependence on Russia created strategic vulnerability, and suddenly, Europe realized something deeply uncomfortable. The continent was not prepared for the kind of war that had returned to its borders. Zelensky understood this fear very clearly. And throughout the war, he consistently pushed European leaders toward a new strategic mindset, one built around military readiness, defense production, technological adaptation, and long-term deterrence against future Russian pressure. In many ways, Zelensky became more than Ukraine's wartime president. He became the political catalyst for Europe's security awakening. That is an extraordinary historical development when you think about it carefully, because Ukraine was not even inside NATO, not inside the European Union. And yet Ukraine's resistance under Zelensky forced Europe itself to rethink its entire post-Cold War security model. This shift is now visible everywhere across the continent. Defense spending is rising at levels not seen in decades. European arms manufacturing is expanding rapidly. Drone warfare programs accelerated dramatically. Border security and cyber defense systems intensified. Military coordination across NATO deepened. Strategic discussions, once considered politically uncomfortable, including conscription, missile defense expansion, and large-scale ammunition production, are now mainstream policy conversations. None of this looked likely before the war, and none of it happens at this scale without Ukrainian resistance surviving long enough to force Europe into strategic adaptation. That is why Putin's original invasion strategy may ultimately become one of the greatest geopolitical miscalculations of the 21st century. The Kremlin expected Ukraine to collapse quickly and Europe to remain divided. Instead, Russia triggered the largest remilitarization of Europe since the Cold War, and Zelensky became the face of that transformation. But the story goes even deeper than military spending alone, because Zelensky also transformed Europe politically. Before the invasion, many European governments still believed stable economic relations with authoritarian powers could gradually reduce geopolitical confrontation. Trade integration was viewed as stabilizing. Russian energy was treated as economically rational despite growing warnings from Eastern Europe. Strategic dependence was tolerated because war itself felt psychologically distant. The invasion destroyed that mindset. Now Europe increasingly views economic dependency as a security risk. Energy security became national security. Supply chains became geopolitical assets. Technology infrastructure became strategic territory. Defense industries became political priorities again. In other words, Europe moved from a globalization mindset toward a geopolitical survival mindset. And Zelensky played a central role in accelerating that transition. Every speech, every wartime appearance, every address to European parliaments, every reminder that Ukraine was fighting not only for itself, but for the future security architecture of Europe. It all reinforced the same message. This war changes the continent permanently. And perhaps the most important part is that European leaders eventually started believing him. Now the consequences of that belief are spreading globally. Russia faces a far more militarized Europe than before the invasion. NATO expanded northward. European defense industries are accelerating long-term production. Eastern European militaries are becoming some of the most heavily armed forces on the continent. And European governments increasingly prepare for strategic competition with Russia not for years, but potentially for generations. That transformation is historically enormous, because Europe spent 30 years trying to move beyond military confrontation politics after the Cold War. Now those politics are back, and Zelensky became one of the central figures driving that return, not because he wanted war, but because Ukrainian survival required convincing Europe that the old assumptions about peace, security, and deterrence no longer matched reality. Tonight, even critics of Zelensky increasingly acknowledge one difficult truth. He did not simply survive Russia's invasion. He forced Europe to confront its own strategic vulnerabilities. And once Europe confronted them, the continent began changing faster than anyone expected. The Ukraine war is still ongoing. The battlefield remains unstable. NATO debates continue. European economies remain under pressure, but one outcome already appears irreversible. The Europe that existed before Zelensky's resistance no longer exists anymore. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this transformation is that it happened under conditions where Ukraine was never supposed to have enough leverage to influence Europe at all. At the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine's primary objective was survival, not reshaping European strategy, not rebuilding NATO, not transforming continental defense policy, simply survival. But prolonged wars often create unexpected political consequences far beyond their original battlefield objectives. And over time, Zelensky realized something that many Western leaders initially underestimated. Ukraine's resistance was psychologically reorganizing Europe itself, because fear changes political behavior very quickly. And the Ukraine war reintroduced fear into European strategic thinking at a scale not seen for generations. Fear of territorial aggression, fear of energy blackmail, fear of military unpreparedness, fear of dependence on hostile powers, fear that the post-Cold War peace model Europe relied upon for decades may no longer protect the continent in a world where major powers are once again willing to use force openly. Zelensky consistently amplified those fears strategically. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but methodically. Every major speech delivered by Zelensky during the war carried a larger message beyond immediate military aid requests. He repeatedly framed Ukraine as Europe's first line of defense, warning that if Russia succeeded in breaking Ukraine through military pressure, the consequences would not stop at Ukrainian borders. That argument resonated especially strongly in Eastern Europe. Poland, The Baltic states, Finland, and other governments geographically closer to Russia already viewed Moscow through a much more security-focused lens than parts of Western Europe traditionally did. Zelensky's warnings reinforced those existing fears and accelerated military planning across the region dramatically. Poland expanded military procurement aggressively. The Baltic states intensified border defense systems. Finland joined NATO. Sweden abandoned decades of military neutrality. These were historic geopolitical shifts, and they happened because the war shattered the assumption that Europe's security order was permanently stable. Putin intended to weaken NATO influence near Russia's borders. Instead, NATO became larger, more unified, and more militarily active than before the invasion. That irony may ultimately define the geopolitical legacy of the war itself. But there is another dimension that makes Zelensky's role even more historically significant tonight. Technology. The Ukraine war transformed Europe's understanding of modern warfare completely. Before 2022, many European military planners still focused heavily on traditional Cold War assumptions, armored formations, large mechanized operations, conventional air superiority models, and relatively centralized battlefield systems. Ukraine changed that. Drone warfare exploded across the battlefield. Commercial technology became military infrastructure, satellite intelligence integrated directly into operational planning, electronic warfare intensified constantly, cyber operations became inseparable from physical combat, and small, highly adaptive systems repeatedly challenged much larger conventional military structures. Europe watched all of this unfold in real time, and European militaries realized they were entering a new era of warfare much faster than expected. Zelensky's government adapted to that reality with extraordinary speed. Ukraine integrated civilian technology into military systems rapidly. Drone production accelerated. Crowd-funded military innovation emerged. Battlefield intelligence networks evolved continuously. And Western defense industries began studying Ukrainian adaptation strategies intensely. This matters because modern wars are increasingly decided not only by industrial size but by technological adaptability under pressure. Ukraine became the testing ground for that future, and Europe knows it. Today, military doctrines across NATO are being rewritten partly because of lessons learned from Ukrainian resistance. Defense companies across Europe now study Ukrainian battlefield innovation directly. Drone manufacturing programs are expanding rapidly. Civil defense planning is intensifying. Cybersecurity investments surged. Ammunition production is increasing at levels unseen in decades. None of this would have happened at the same speed without the political and military pressure generated by Zelensky's wartime leadership, which is why some analysts now argue that Zelensky's greatest geopolitical achievement was not simply preserving Ukraine's sovereignty, but forcing Europe to psychologically re-enter strategic reality. That phrase matters. Strategic reality. Because after the Cold War, many European societies gradually shifted toward the belief that economics could permanently replace power politics as the organizing principle of international relations. Trade would create stability. Interdependence would reduce war risks. Globalization would gradually integrate rival powers into cooperative systems. The Ukraine war shattered that belief brutally. Now Europe increasingly prepares for a world defined by competition, deterrence, energy security, military readiness, and technological rivalry again. That is a profound historical shift. And Zelensky sits directly at the center of it. Even Europe's political culture is changing under the pressure of this war. Defense discussions, once considered politically toxic, are now normalized. Military service debates returned. Civil preparedness planning expanded. Infrastructure protection became strategic policy. Governments increasingly discuss resilience rather than efficiency alone. That word, resilience, may ultimately define Europe's new security philosophy, not permanent peace. Prepared resilience. And that philosophy emerged directly from the shock generated by Ukraine's resistance against Russia. Meanwhile, Russia itself now faces a Europe fundamentally different from the one it confronted in early 2022. More militarized, more psychologically alert, more suspicious of dependency, more focused on strategic autonomy, and more willing to spend enormous resources on defense over long periods. That transformation may create consequences lasting decades beyond the war itself, because military-industrial systems, once rebuilt, tend to sustain themselves politically. Strategic fear, once internalized, rarely disappears quickly, and alliance structures strengthened during wartime often continue expanding long afterward. This is why the war's final geopolitical outcome remains so difficult to predict. Even if front lines eventually stabilize, even if negotiations eventually happen, even if some territorial disputes freeze temporarily, Europe itself has already changed. The continent thinks differently now, plans differently now, prepares differently now, and fears differently now. That transformation cannot easily be reversed. Which brings us back to Zelensky himself. When historians eventually study this period decades from now, they may conclude that his most important achievement was not simply keeping Kiev from falling. It was convincing Europe that survival in the 21st century still requires power, preparation, and strategic endurance in ways many Europeans had almost forgotten entirely. He did not merely survive the invasion. He reshaped the mindset of an entire continent. And tonight, Europe is still living inside the consequences of that transformation.